Good afternoon, everybody. Today we have the pleasure of hearing the continuing story and the life of our neighbor and friend Ed Warner. A little about Ed. Ed was born, raised, and educated in Washington, D.C. He graduated from the Catholic University in 1951 with a degree in aeronautical engineering. He was recruited by General Electric. He reported to work at the Evandale, Ohio facility as a junior engineer in the jet engine department. Ed spent 38 years with different manufacturing companies, ending his career as Chief Operating Officer at Colt Industries. Between his wife, Linda, they claimed 6 children, 8 grandchildren, and 8 great-grandchildren. Ed's main interest is oil painting. You may have seen his show at Tide Point Activity Room, and I understand he's going to have another show this year?
January or February.
January or February. Okay, very. We're all looking forward to it, Ed.
All right.
Please join me in welcoming Ed Warner.
Thank you, thank you. Start off a little miffed here this afternoon. I just ran into a friend out here before I walked in, and I said to this person, I won't name the sex, I said, "Are you coming into the show?" And he said, "Oh yes, I wouldn't miss it." I said, "Well, good." I said, "I hope I can make it interesting to a certain extent." He says, "I don't care about that. I want to be there when you stop talking." So here I am once again. So anyways, as you heard, I'm Ed Warner, and hopefully this will be the last part of this talk. You never can tell because there's no end to this. It's just a number of little vignettes and anecdotes about what happened on the more or less humorous side through the 38-year career I had. And so I talked to Lee a little bit about what we could do maybe to speed it up. And he says, "Well, just tell the audience to start listening faster." So I want to see if you can do that. But anyways, the story starts when I was leaving, making a real vigorous effort to leave Allis-Chalmers. The company, because of the 2 top management people, were beginning to implode. They were doing all kinds of, excuse the expression, stupid things. And we had spent almost 3 years building up new organizations, bringing in good people from the outside, getting things really running, hitting budgets and so forth. And then they started making decisions that made no sense. And we couldn't go along with it. We could not turn our back on these people we brought in. They changed their career and so forth. And so we decided we would stick with our approach, but it became obvious either get out or quit this and become one of the old liners, so to speak. So I opted to get out. And then, since salary was somewhat important in those days, I didn't want to opt out before I had something else to do. So anyways, we went to work and contacted everybody I knew in every business, all the headhunters I knew, everybody that had gone, I'd worked with someplace and so forth, and trying to find it. And we really were sending out paperwork and resumes and everything else. It reminded me very much of the story of, excuse me here. This is, maybe I should just cover it quickly for the people who had not been here before. In GE, I joined him as a test engineer, was selected to go on the creative engineering program that was 2 years of beating your head into learning how to create night and day, weekends, and everything else. And then I joined the automation department with building automation equipment very early in the days of automation, setting up an example for the different departments of GE, what you could do in this area. And then they asked me to take over the advanced manufacturing engineering lab, where we built the very first robot that would work in a manufacturing facility, for instance, just one of the things. Then I moved from there to man-made diamonds. Before anybody asked, no, we didn't make big diamonds. We just made stuff that looked like gravel, but it was used in grinding wheels and very essential to manufacturing, because to use anything else on hardened steel parts to get nice finishes and tolerances was impossible. So, and all the diamonds have been coming out of South Africa. So we went into business, took De Beers on, and developed the man-made diamond, and really had quite a business. But I was lured from there to Allis-Chalmers, where they were going to rebuild everything in the company, become a great GE itself, and so forth. And I'd taken over the manufacturing part of the farm equipment division. And just in case you never knew, but manure spreaders come in 57 varieties. It's very important that people know that. And I could explain it to you, but I won't, the process at this point. But anyway, so the big push was on to get out of there and to get to some good career base and so forth. And so we were looking diligently at everything and so forth. And I had to show you, this is a little out of line, but there was a cat down there also that was hunting at the same time for me. And so let me tell you the story of that. It goes back to this old farmer. His name is Caleb. Remember that, because we'll meet Caleb again in a little while. And he was downtown one day, and he met the vet. And he says to him, he says, my cat, my good barn cat's not feeling too well. He's not doing much anymore. So the vet says to him, he says, well, give him some castor oil. In fact, give him as much castor oil as you can get down him. So the farmer went home and did that. And next week, he ran into the vet again, went Saturday shopping, and he says, how was the cat? He says, well, I don't really know. He says, you don't know? He says, the last time I saw him, he was going over the back hill with 9 other cats. He says, 3 digging, 3 covering up, and 3 scouting new territory. So that was about the way the effort was going to find a new job. But anyways, I finally found the right job in Colt. It had been quite a task. I'd interviewed a number of different places: Case, New Holland, International Harvester, so forth. But this was probably the most interesting and different meeting of two minds between Colt and myself that I ever run into. I was in the office one day at Allis-Chalmers, got a phone call from a gentleman that announced he was from Colt Industries. They had seen my resume, and they'd like me to meet Mr. Scott, who was the chief operating officer of the company. And I said, well, that's fine. He says, and we'd like you to have dinner with him tonight. I said, oh, is he Milwaukee or Chicago? 90 miles away. No, he's in Hartford. Well, I said, how am I going to have dinner with him? He says, because there'll be an airplane out there at 5 o'clock to pick you up. Oh, an airplane to pick me up. That kind of puffed me up a little bit. And sure enough, we went out and flew to Hartford. His car picked me up, took me to his home in West Hartford, a huge mansion. A man in a white jacket met me at the front door. Mr. Warner come in, and we went into the library, and then Mr. Scott comes in. And immediately I knew Mr. Scott because I had worked on a project that he was in charge of in GE several years before that. He had the job of making a commercially feasible magnetron tube. Now that fascinates all of you, a magnetron tube. Every one of you has got one. And every one of you depends on it. Do you know what it is? It's the thing that makes a microwave work. That little gun in there that shoots out the radar that cooks your food. But anyways, that's how I'd met him. So we got along fine. Had a nice dinner. It was time for me to leave and go get the airplane to go home. He says, I think you'll fit. I said, I think I'll fit, okay. Anyways, we got out on the airplane. I was home about 2:30 in the morning in Milwaukee. So that was quite an interview. The next week, they called me into New York to meet the other executives and also to take the psych test. You know, all these pages of tests, like, would you rather handle snakes or would you rather be a florist? You know, do you like your mother-in-law better than castor oil, for instance, or something like this? All these tests. Well, and I took the test, and the next day I had set up an appointment to go to IT&T in New York. So I went in, met them briefly in the morning. Says, we're going to put you through a test now, a psych test. And I said, okay, I'm getting good at this. You know, so they sat me down and said, we're going to do the first half, and we'll have lunch, then you'll do the second half. So I sat down, he left, and opened up the psych test. Guess what? It was the same one I had done the afternoon before. Now, should I go ahead and tell him, or just be a brilliant individual and do it, you know, in a hurry, see? So I said, well, they're not interested in the time, they're interested in the answers, so I'll give them the same answers. So I opened it up, and when he came in to get me at lunch, he says, how are you coming? I said, well, I finished about 10 minutes ago. He says, good, you'll get the second half, you know, this afternoon. I said, no, I finished the whole thing. He says, finish the whole thing? And I said, yeah. In fact, I even embellished it like ink blot test. They show a man looking at a dog, see. I said, a man in a hat, in fact, a derby hat, looking at the shaggy dog that was sitting there under the street lamp. And so I could do all that and just go tearing through it. Well, we went to lunch, and there was a lot of talk about the test and so forth. And then they talked to me some more. And then finally they said, you know, we think that you are too qualified for this job. And I said, well, let's don't jump to any conclusions. I said, what in the world is the job? They said, well, we're building a brand new plant out in California to build flash cubes for cameras. And I said to myself, within the last 2 weeks, I just read an article about how these little strobe lights or whatever they call in cameras are going to push that business all out. And I said to him, I said, that doesn't kind of ring a bell. Why would they be wanting to build? He says, we don't ask questions. The boss says he wants a plant out there. We're going to build a plant for him. So anyways, we parted, and he said, we'll call you if there's something better. And they did about 3 or 4 weeks later, but we never went any further, and then I had already taken the job. So, but Colt is a New York-based conglomerate. Each company within Colt ran as an individual company. The only reason you had contact with New York is that each year you convinced them that the money they would put into the business was a good banking venture. And then they, of course, would watch you to make sure that you were performing properly. And then it still was growing through acquisitions. They were buying companies that had a future and so forth. And then offered the position of president of Elox company. And the trouble is, it was located in Detroit. I had just come from Detroit, and that's not a good place to live, even in the summertime. But I wanted something down south, but we missed on that one. But anyways, Elox, let me get here just a moment. Elox is a company that builds machine tools that cut metal with sparks. Now, I'm not going to get into the technical aspect of this, but it was invented by a young man by the name of Larkins. It was invented during the Second World War, and it would be classified as one of the unsung heroes of the home front. You imagine during the Second World War when they were pounding out these aircraft engines, tank engines, heavy boat engines, all this type of thing with these large castings, so forth. And they would machine these things hours and hours and hours. And the last thing that would happen is they would be putting a tapped hole and a mounting plate on the side of one of these things, and that tap would break off in the hole. That was the end of it. They couldn't send it out. You could not put the parts together that would make the engine run and so forth. They had to get that broken tap out of the hole. He invented a process where he went down with a metal rod, caused a spark to happen between the rod and that broken piece down in that hole, and just ate that thing out of there. Took time, ate it out of there and into little particles and so forth. Therefore, put the piece back in the production line without missing days and days and a lot of effort to do it other ways. But anyways, he made it a company. And just to bore you a little bit more, you can, with that ELOX process, or the EDM process, you could drill holes in hardened metal that you cannot make any other way. For instance, down at the bottom right-hand corner, there's a square hole. Did you ever see a drill that can drill a square hole in anything? That you can with this process. Or you can take that cone shape up above and go down through there. Each little spark that jumped from the electrode, which is the upper piece, to the base metal that you're cutting, took out a little tiny piece of metal. You could hardly feel it. But when you were doing it 2,000 to 3,000 times a second with much higher power, you begin to eat that thing out pretty fast. The result is that today, many things that are difficult to machine are done with this process. Like you take a Coke bottle, the shape of it, so forth, that molds for that are made out of this process because they can make any shape they want to and without all kinds of machining and grinding and handwork and so forth. So it's a pretty interesting process. When I got there, they were doing very well, but it was they met a ceiling. They could find no new applications for it. Well, with some hard work, they began to move it into production where they were making production parts with this process instead of making the tool for it. But anyways, no sooner had I gotten there, well, two things happened. No sooner did I get there than I was given the terrible job of going to Europe every 3 months to straighten out our licensees, 2 in France, 2 in England, 1 in Spain, and I think 1 in Germany, because we had bad contracts with them, so forth. It was really terrible having to go over there every 3 months, eat all that bad food, and do that. But that was one of the jobs that had to be done, so that was what we did. The other thing is that they came to me one day and said, we're moving out of Detroit, the top bankers. We don't want the company in Detroit any longer. Where do we put it? Well, I'd always thought south. I was born in the South, always thought south. And so I start looking at our different possibilities. One of them was a little plant we already had down there that made some electrical supplies for the ELOX machines. One was West Hartford, where we had a big machine tool company, and one was on the West Coast where we had a small machine tool company. So I studied it very carefully, making sure I didn't push too hard for the South, but somehow they said, we're going to move south to Davidson, North Carolina, which is a very small town north of Charlotte. And so we went ahead and we expanded the plant down there and moved 35 people out of Detroit, engineers and so forth down there. And the move went very well. It had some bumps here and there and so forth, but and I'll tell you about one little bump we had, which opened up to me what the real relationship was between the South and the North, or I'll even say the whites and the blacks. We no sooner got down there, and one of the fellows in working in the plant went out at lunchtime, came back and he said, somebody stole the damn battery out of my car. Well, cars were lined up in the parking lot, nosed in this hedgerow-like street just on the other side of it, Main Street. Everybody rushes out. They found out that there was 4 cars the batteries had missed. They missed out of it. And so we called up the police. And within 2 seconds, up comes the police car. And here's Ron Steiger. Sitting there, said, you all got some problems? He said, yes, somebody has stolen the batteries out of these cars. Well, he says, Mr. Warner, he says, you and Mr. Thomas, who was the plant manager, you've got a few minutes, we'll get this all straightened out right now. So we go out of there and we go down the road, no more than a mile, turn onto a little rutted dirt road, and here's this compound of old trailers, little shacks, so forth, with quite a population of folks in there. Hits the siren, turns the light on, gets the bullhorn out. Everybody, over here right now. Get your butts over here now. Boy, don't stand there. Get over here. I got something to tell you. And so I'm standing there with Mr. Thomas, and the deputy with him. He gets out the car, the other side, undoes the fastener on his holster. I said, I don't know what we're getting into, but I wish I wasn't here. And so the sheriff says, now we've had a little problem up here. He says, somebody, I'm not talking about you, I'm just somebody you probably know. Thought that place up there was a new auto parts store, didn't you? You're going to get free batteries and so forth. Well, he says, no, it's not going to work that way. He says, we're not going to do that. We're going to treat these people well because they're down here. They're giving you jobs. We already had 6 or 7 of the folks from that down there working in the plant and so forth. So he says, now, I tell you what, he says, I know none of you did this, but I know you probably know somebody that did it. And I recommend that by 4:30, all those batteries be back up there. And he says, now, he says, that's all I got to say. Just make sure. Oh, I'll tell you one thing. He says, we can't find the batteries up there. He says, we're going to tear this place to the ground until we find it. Do you understand me? Yeah, yes, sir, yes, sir. So we went back up, and the batteries were there by 4:30. Each one was in the car, 3 of them. The 4th one was sitting on the ground next to the car, and this is something we've never figured out. The battery was sitting there. There was an old crescent wrench that you'd use maybe to put it in there, and a $1 bill crumpled up. And we can't figure out whether they were telling us a story or didn't have time to do it, thought we would be okay if we had the dollar to cover our labor or what. But it was quite a feeling, and I still to this day will stop and wonder what he was trying to tell us, whoever it was. But anyways, that was getting used to the South. And there was other things too. Here's an example of, now this is not political, don't get wrong. That's a picture of the Franklin D. Roosevelt dime with a hole through it. That's the type of thing we could do with some of our equipment. There's no other way you could possibly do that without this electrical discharge machining. So it had quite a lot of potential, good potential. Then we were down there 2 or 3 years, and we were beating the budget right and left into the incentive program deeply every year and so forth. And finally, my boss, who was known as Attila the Hun behind his back, is the way he treated people, but he came down and he says, Ed, he says, I got to reduce your pay. And I said, wonderful, wonderful. And he says, yeah. He says, we got to break the incentive compensation formula just for you because you keep earning too much money. And I said, okay. I said, that's great, guy. I said, great. We don't have to work on nights, and we don't have to work Saturdays and Sundays anymore. We can just do kind of a miserable little job, and you'll be happy with that? Well, we'll talk about it later. And he went back to New York and never heard another thing about it. But that December, when we went up to present the budgets, the chairman reviewed the budget, George Streichman, and he looked at our budget, and I thought this is going to be it. He's going to stab us. He says, Ed, that budget's too tough, reduce it. I said, what? He says, the budget's too tough, reduce it. I looked at my boss, the one that wanted to reduce the pay and everything else. He just went like this, and here we went. We went out and celebrated half the night because we thought we had a tough budget put in there, and here's the chairman that backed us up on it, took it down. So it was a nice relationship. But anyways, one of the episodes that happened, in fact, towards the end of one of the years that we were down there, we had made up actually 4 special EOX machines for Israel's aircraft industries. Did not know what they were going to be used for, knew the part, but not how it all fit together. And they delivered them over there just before the end of the year. The cable snapped from the boat. They were lowering it down to the dock, and it went into 40 feet of water. And we said, holy cow. He says, that amount of money is out of our budget. We're not going to hit the year-end budget, with that kind of loss and so forth. And then all of a sudden, the Israeli purchasing agent for New York called up. He says, Ed, we got to have 4 more machines. I said, well, we'll be glad to build them, but he says, no, we want them now, right now. And I said, it's going to cost you all kinds. He said, you didn't hear me. I want those shipped now, see. So we went to work and we got them out by the end of the year, and we're able to bill them by the end of the year and hit the budget because of there. But that was just unusual. I did ask him later on, because he'll come up in the story a little later on, what happened? he says, well, he says the operator up there seemed to, be one of these guys wearing a towel on his head. And he says he just knew how to snap that cable and break it off. I said, what is he doing now? He says, Ed, you don't want to ask all those questions. So I said, okay, we'll forget that aspect of it. But anyways, then another thing was that we had a big customer over in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and part of the nuclear bomb program that was still building a lot of that type of equipment. And he would come over every once in a while, pick up new tooling, pick up the machines and so forth for the, to keep his factory or his shop going. But he had a very good source of the best, probably white lightning anybody's ever tasted. And he would send this over several cases with the driver that came over to pick up the toolings or the machine, whatever it was. And so it became kind of a stable there. We had a distributor that came in from, by the way, somebody said, how do we know it's any good? He says, you go around and you pick out a bottle here and there and a random out of these cases. And he says, you have the driver take a sip. And he says, if he's not blind within an hour, it's good stuff. So I said, okay. But anyways, we had a distributor, one of our big distributors from, I think it was Los Angeles. It must have been Los Angeles. And he came in and we played golf. And after golf, we were sitting there and we were going to have a drink. And we offered him some of this, and he sipped it. And, he just loved this. And he wanted some. So we supplied him with a bottle, and he went home. And he says, then about 2 weeks later, he calls up and he says, Ed, he says, I want to tell you that we had the greatest party that you've ever been to. He says, my wife is in politics in Santa Monica. She's on the board. She knows the mayor, whoever it was. There's a bunch of stuffed shirts. But she made up this punch that was just so super. These people all became human. He says the mayor was sitting on the back of the couch lecturing somebody and slowly slipped backwards off the couch. And I said, what in the world happened? He says, well, the bottle you gave me was in a either a gin bottle or a vodka bottle. You had to transport it that way because it looked clear. And he says, my wife didn't understand that. And she dumped the whole bottle into this punch. And she says, just a wonderful time, and I thank you. So, but anyways, it was a lot of hard work, and we got that company really growing, and it looked like they had a great future. And then, unfortunately, I left. And not because I wanted to. We'd been down there 5 years. We had a beautiful home. We knew lots of people. The kids were growing up down there and so forth. That in itself was a story. The first day of school, the first year we were there, my second son went to high school and came home and said, well, what'd you do today? Well, we practiced riots. I said, practice riots? What do you mean? He says, well, when the whistle blew, we ran to the inner wall, sat down with our head against the wall and between our knees. I said, why in the world is that? He says, Dad, he says, they're integrating the schools, and they don't want to integrate the schools. And so he says that, I said, was there any trouble? He says, yeah. He says, a whole busload of people came and were going to break open the school and separate the people out violently if they had to. They take the white kids out or the black kids out or whatever it was. So that was not a nice part of it, but they got over it after a while. But anyways, my boss, Attila the Hun, came down one day. He says, we're moving you up to Hartford to run the gun plant. And I said, I don't want I don't want to go up there. I don't want to leave Charlotte. I don't want to make guns, and I don't like cold. That's all right. He says, you'll like it up there, And I said, no, I'm not going to go up there. Well, he says, think about it. So I thought about it, and one day he calls up. He says, well, have you been thinking about it? You're ready to go? And I said, no. He said, well, I give you two options. He says, resign yourself to the fact you're going up there, or resign. I said, oh, well, nobody had ever explained it exactly that way to me. So off we went to Hartford. And that was certainly a different experience. The gun plant and business, in a lot of ways, was certainly a museum in motion. This is just a section of the original plant. It went on for several blocks this way and several blocks that way, and a good block in that way, just hundreds, thousands of people making guns up there. That dome up on top, that was Sam Colt's idea. He went to Turkey to convince them to buy guns and became enamored with that type of shape and so forth, came home, had that built up there. We restored it while I was there, including the stars and everything else, based on old photographs, not with the fancy Colt way up on top, but the big dome itself. But anyways, it's here's the first gun he built, the #1 patent gun. It was quite an invention. Nobody had come up at that point with that revolving cylinder so you could repeat the firing 6 times before you had to reload. And the little knife on the end of it was just in case it didn't fire, which probably was a pretty sensible thing, but in those days. But here's guns that became very, very popular in the Civil War. Unfortunately, it's not too good a picture, but the upper one is the Army version of the 1851 Navy down below. A couple of things here interesting. If you notice around back of the cylinder, the kind of grayish brownish look, that was a mistake that they made in the factory one day. They were hardening some of these pieces, and a guy that was tending it was eating his lunch, and they say deer, off a deer bone, like a deer chop or something like this. He threw the bones into the fire, and this came out permanently modeled like that. It became one of the trademarks of Colt. Nobody else knew how to do it, and it was just fastened onto by all the people interested in it. So, but it was a 6-shooter, and it had little tiny caps that went on the end of the cylinders in here, and when the hammer came down, the cap would blow up, and the packed powder, manually packed in there, would go off and blow the lead slug out the other end. The set that normally came, well, you see the powder horn, the real fancy thing on the left. Right by the end of it is the bullet mold, where they had to make their own bullets and melt lead and make their own bullets. But anyways, thousands of these things were produced. Just up to the start of the war, he was making them for both sides. But at the outbreak of the war, it was decided probably not a good political thing to make them for the South anymore. So, but here's an example of the carved or the engraved Colts. I wish I could remember who had this set of guns, but you can see all over it the engraving into the hard metal. You can see gold inlay. The picture doesn't show it, but a lot of the outline work is solid gold. There's some silver inlay in there and so forth. And then the ivory grips, which of course are illegal anymore. But that was an 1872 model right there, which was the gun that won the West. And thousands of those were produced. 1879, the double action came in. What's a double action? Well, these guns had to have that hammer cocked back, and then you pull the trigger to fire it. In the double action, you pulled the trigger and the hammer came back and fired automatically over and over again, 6 shots. You see these cowboy movies, and of course most of them they've shot 9 or 12 shots out of each gun, but anyways, they would hold the trigger back on the old model, hold the trigger back, and then fan, if you've seen them in the movies. And that would bring the hammer back and let it fall on the shell and fire. So, but that was, I really wanted to show you the example of the engraving they've done, still do it to this day in different grades and so forth. This gun here, I wish you could see the rest of it because it's a long barrel. It's got all kinds of engraving on it, inlay work and everything else done by Indians. Indians love to get these things, put jewels all over them and so forth. This particular gun has Jack on the grip down here. Particular gun was the gun that the orchestra leader for, was it Wild Bill Cody show or whichever one the big show was. They could use that as a baton for all the time that they ever show with a real long barrel on it. So here's the Dirty Harry 357, engraved heavily. 6 of them sent to the king of Jordan, who was celebrating something, and 5 of them he gave to other Islamic leaders over in that area. When I got there, I said, why this gun is so powerful and so deadly, let's put it that way, why aren't we making the short barrel, the little 38 that had no barrel on it at all that the cops would use in a holster down by their ankle or something like this? Why don't we make one in 357? Well, I was told that you couldn't control it. It just would be out of your hand almost. I said, well, baloney, let's make one. So we made one. They invited me down to the test tube to fire it. So I've got into the grip as best I could and fired the first one, came close to hitting the target, fired the second one, hit the cord that held the target, fired the third time, and hit the ceiling almost above me. I said, well, you're right, it's too strong. But anyways, the factory made a great number of guns at any one time, different models. Those models, 1861 and so forth, still in production because black powder was very popular, is very popular with people. They love to load their gun, make their own slugs and so forth and fire it. So we're still making those in various sizes, anywhere from the pocket to the great big Dragoon, which was the pre-Civil War gun. So these are a very bad picture of the Browning Colt automatic, the old Colt 45. The upper one was the first models up there, probably not in 45, that probably 38. But when the Spanish-American War came up and they were having a great deal of trouble stopping the natives from charging over in the Philippines because they were hopped up on whatever the bean is they chew all the time, they needed something that was, they said, make him sit down. And so they came up with a 45, which is the middle gun here, which shoots a large slug of lead, and it hits somebody, no matter what they're doing, they're going to sit down or fall down mostly. But so that gun was the standard for the Army from 1914 till just about 10, 12 years ago when they changed over to a 9mm. But and I won't get into ballistics and so forth. But oh yeah, the other thing is we ran a tour service there. Everybody who ever heard of loves guns. Everybody. Here's you can recognize who this is. He's giving me heck there because we were going to take him out to lunch and we took the picture in front of a snack machine. Yeah, anybody and everybody that came near Hartford wanted to tour through the gun factory, and so we'd spent a lot of time doing that. And then I got to tell you something else, that anybody that made guns, ran a gun company, unfairly, was deemed a god. You made guns, and in the South and the Southwest, you could walk on water. You could perform magic, anything. You were revered. And I didn't really realize what they would do for you or to you because of that. We went down to Houston one time for a big gun show. And it was announced to me that the sheriff of the county was going to pick me up and take me downtown to the hotel. Well, you've all had experiences or heard about experiences like bungee jumping off of bridges or climbing up 3,000 straight sheer cliffs and so forth, and doing things like that for a big excitement. You've got to try the Houston Squeeze in the police department in the middle of rush hour. We went downtown 70 miles an hour through solid traffic, and that's why I call it the Houston Squeeze. Not only that, but the deputy that was driving the sheriff at the time his nickname was Squeeze because he was the best driver they had, and he could get through the smallest parts. Now, you'll see that a lot of people were saluting us, and I couldn't figure it out. They only had one finger up, and they were saluting us as we went by. So, but anyways, it was just one of those things. Guns are a part of the religion in a lot of this country, and I that's all I can say about it. Is now we come to the M16. Now everybody says, uh-oh, AR-15, automatic rifle, bad. Our company policy was we sold to nobody but the military or approved organizations overseas or to police and so forth. It's a fascinating piece of machinery if you stop and think about it. One thing I want to point out to you is that you notice how that stock on the far end there goes straight back and how the sights are up elevated. This was a revolutionary change in rifles because up to that time, stocks always came down to bring the barrel up to eye level. And here you have the stock into your shoulder, but your eye level is up above the barrel and that way. Why is that important? Well, when you sent that thing on automatic, fire on automatic, and the old stock would be down below that barrel, you could not hold that gun down. But with the stock directly back into your shoulder and no physics that's going to make it turn up, then you've got a steady gun that you can hold on the target. Now, it's a military. We built a military weapon. We were only interested in the military aspect of it. It's not all nice, but it is. It does a job. We've got to stop enemy with it. It shoots a bullet that's hardly any bigger than a .22, but it has so much powder behind it, it sends it out at a speed that's almost unstable, meaning that if it was any faster, it would start tumbling. What happens is that when a slug hits something, it turns into a buzzsaw. Terrible wound, but that's the military, that's war. So we made those things in great numbers and so forth. A lot of countries bought them in great numbers. Kuwait, our salesman over there, said Kuwait had enough M16s to equip every man, woman, child, dog, and camel. And there's still some more. We don't know where they went to, but so it's quite a machinery. It's quite a development there. A lot of plastic in it. And the other important thing is that it is 6 pounds lighter than the preceding rifle. 6 pounds, that's a lot, especially when you say, I can now carry 6 pounds more of ammunition with it than I did before. So anyways, there's a lot of guns out there, a lot of spin-offs of guns. They're harpoon guns, underwater guns, starting guns, stopping guns. We even built some modified guns for Logan Airport where they had to shoot down the runway to get the birds to take off so the airplanes could move. You remember a few years ago about the plane that landed in the East River caused by the birds stuffing up the engine. So that was one way of getting rid of those. But our friend here, Ebenezer, the old farmer, invented a new one. And it's called a sex signal. And you say, wait a minute, what is sex signal? Well, one day he started off up to the back 40 of his farm and in springtime, looking over how the fence did and all this sort of thing. And he says, he got up there and he smelled some honeysuckle and the warm sun, bird call, and my God, he got this strange feeling. He went a little bit further and he recognized it as a romantic feeling. He says, my God, a romantic, I've got to get home. I've got to get back to Martha. So he starts running down the hill, yelling, Martha, Martha, come out here, Martha. Well, he gets down close to the barn and he can't go any further. And he's just pooped out. Martha's heard this and she runs out to him. What's happened? A heart attack or what? No. And he tells her about this experience he's had. She says, that's wrong. We can't ever have that happen again. You get that feeling. He says, we've got to get together some way quick. So he thinks about it. He says, I'm going to take my old gun out there. And he says, when I fire the gun, you come running from the barn, from the house, and I'll come running from the field, and we'll meet no matter where, the orchard, or the hay barn, or whatever. And so he was telling his friend this downtown one time, and the friend said, did it work? He says, oh, it was perfect. It was a great spring and summer. And he says, well, how's Martha doing? He says, well, she's gone. She passed. He says, Martha's gone, passed. Yeah, she ran herself to death during the hunting season. So anyways, now Jane, I rubbed my nose there. That's it. Now you're getting the idea. When I rub my nose, you clap. Okay. There. Anyways, things went very well there. We got made some big improvements in the firearms part of it. In fact, by the way, I got a hold. When I went up to Hartford, I had just the commercial end of it. I did not have the military. But about 4 weeks later, I got the military because the government had decided or found out that the military was sending parts to Yugoslavia who were forwarding to South Africa, which was absolutely against the law. And to settle the whole matter, Colt said, we'll fire the whole management group and the military and consolidate it back to commercial again, which they did. So all of a sudden I had that pleasure also. But anyways, after being up there about 5 years, I married Linda and bought a great big house, and we were redoing that. And she was very good at stripping wallpaper off and plaster. I was impressed by her, and decided maybe I should keep a hold of this one. So anyways, we worked all winter diligently. Comes the springtime, the first day we decided, on a weekend, to take off to go and sit out on this new sun porch. The telephone rings, and guess who calls the boss? You're going to California. And I said, well, I'm not going to California. He says, Ed, we went through this once before. You're going to California. So off we went to Burbank, California, to the Monasco division that makes some really exciting products. It's called landing gears. I don't know why these came out as bad as this picture, but there was 4 companies, 3 manufacturing companies and 1 repair company that made landing gears. Now, you don't think that's exciting, do you? Well, if it wasn't for landing gears, we wouldn't have airplanes, because you got to roll them fast enough to get off the ground, and when they come in and go through their crash motions, you got to have those landing gears to catch on the bottom. So we made landing gears out there. We made in Fort Worth, we made F-16 landing gears, 9,000 of them. The F-16 was all over the world. It was a hot airplane, and replaced by a dual engine airplane, because the big drawback is the F-16 has 1 engine. It quits, you quit, at that point. And there was no sooner got out there, well, I was probably within 6 months I got out there, we got a call from the Mexican Air Force that one of the landing gears had failed on the F-16. And so they had a crew that went out immediately, looked at any problem that happened like this. And sure enough, there was the airplane on its belly out there with the landing gear up and so forth. And they soon discovered that what it was that the pilot had hit the retract button as he was taxiing out to take off. Down it came on his stomach, skated along and so forth. And so, well, all of a sudden it was our problem because the landing gear didn't work. Well, they went ahead and satisfied themselves. It was the landing gear was retracted. And so the colonel or whoever it was, the question was he going to be cashiered before this or what? It turns out to be a hero. This airplane was taxiing out, getting ready to take off, when all of a sudden the throttle took over by itself. The plane started to rush forward. The brakes wouldn't work on the wheels on the landing gear. The only thing to save the whole Air Force was to hit the landing gear, retract. Down it came and stopped. And I said, how did they come up with that? He says, to the colonel that was in charge of this whole investigation, he says, oh, very easy. He says, he is the son of the Minister of Agriculture. I said, oh, okay. But anyways, the Boeing 737, we built the landing gear for that up in Canada. It's 77 tons when it comes down onto the landing gear. Now, you probably never praised the landing gear when you got down on the ground. Never even thought about it. So, and the space shuttle, loaded. Of course, we didn't take off on wheels. It took off on the nose of a rocket. Was 2,250 tons. When it came back, it was 82 tons. But it was a typical landing gear project. They said, we want to come in with 82 tons. We want a safety factor of another 20%. We want the landing gear to go up through a little hole in the bottom of the airplane, no bigger than this. We want it all to fold up into a little size of a bread box. All impossible, but that's where you start on each one of these projects. So, and then when I got out there, they were just about to start the 7th and final test on the landing gear on that. And we were watching it on television in Burbank come in, and there was with us a man from NASA who was on another project we were working on, and he says to me, he says, Ed, he says, you pack your suitcase? I said, no. He says, you got a passport? And I said, yeah. He says, well, if I were you, he says, I'd look up a list of countries that don't have this policy of changing, wanted criminals back and forth, whatever the name of that is. And he says, I said, why is that? He says, if that blank thing fails, he says, you're going to want to get out of town in a hurry. So I said, okay. It worked, fortunately. Then one of the funny things that happened, I was going to an AIA meeting down at the Wigwam in Phoenix. Some of you have been there on the big resort. And we came in from the airport in one of their little jitneys, and one of the passengers with us was Neil Armstrong. And so we were riding along, and I had met him as a group before. I didn't know him well at all. But when we got off the bus there, the bellhop comes running out, and he grabs my suitcase, and he says, I know you, I've seen you on TV, I know who you are. I said, no, you don't. I said, you know that guy there. And he says, pointing at Neil Armstrong, he says, why, who's he? And I said, Neil Armstrong. He proceeds to drop the suitcase, bang, on my foot. I was forgotten completely, and he was over there after Neil Armstrong. And so Neil says, I probably shouldn't use, well, yeah, Neil said to me, he says, I'll get you. So he introduced me as something very important to every person that worked in the damn hotel. Every time he had a chance, come here, I want you to meet somebody important. But I said, okay, you win. I said, when you're over in Lockheed sometime at the Skunk Works where they do all their development work, I said, come on over, and he says, give you a tour or at least buy you a lunch. So he did. He called a month or two later, and he came over, and we had the executives of the two plants there and myself, and so we had a nice chat. And so one of them said to Neil, he says, what about this business about that all that landing on the moon was all fake, that was staged in Hollywood? And he says, well, that was just a lot of baloney. He says, that didn't happen at all. And he says, but I'll tell you what, something you can discuss. He says, who took the picture of me coming off the shuttle off the lander the first time? And we said, well, somebody said, well, it's on the camera's on the strut or something, landing strut. He says, you look at the landing strut. He says, that's back of me. Both of them are back of me. I was coming down to the one in front. He says, that's all I'm going to say about that. So, real nice guy. He died probably about 10 years ago. And it was really a loss, because here was a living, breathing example of what we have accomplished as a man. I mean, the lander was one thing, and the rocks they brought back with another, but this was a guy that had really done it and gone through it and so forth. So how are we doing here? Are we oh, I didn't, huh? 5 minutes? Okay. Another thing we did in Monasco was build shock absorbers for the ICBM launching tubes. They calculated that if an atomic bomb was set off over the top of one of these tubes with our missile in it, it would drive the ground down 17 feet and then come back a ways like a spring. Well, we built the shock absorbers that would take that shock with this whole tube and missile down, and then bring it back up slowly to its final position ready for launch. And that was quite a project. We also built a lot of shock absorbers for large electrical equipment to stand earthquakes and so forth. Well, anyways, at that point, after that, all those episodes, I was sent back to Hartford and to New York City at the higher level, and things weren't nearly as much fun as when you're out on the manufacturing floor and dealing with a product. You were dealing with a lot of people that, sometimes were okay and sometimes were a little nutty, but anyways, I'll end it there so we don't have to go any further. Okay?